We now have official confirmation that the US economy has dramatically slowed down. In recent days, I've shared a whole bunch of numbers with my readers that clearly demonstrate that a new economic downturn has begun. And even though stock prices have been rising, the numbers for the real economy have been depressingly bad lately. But what we didn't have was official confirmation from the Federal Reserve that the economy is really slowing down. But now we do. According to the Atlanta Fed GDP Now model, the U.S. economy is growing at a 0.3% annualized rate in the first quarter, based on data on domestic construction spending in December released on Monday. The Atlanta Federal Reserve's GDP Now forecast model showed. For years, the goal has been to get U.S. growth above the key 3% threshold. But what this forecast is telling us is that economic growth is currently at 1/10 of that level. That is just barely above recession territory. So when I say we're teetering on the brink of a recession, I am not exaggerating. We also just got some really bad news about construction spending. Construction spending fell 0.6% in December from November, based on a seasonally adjusted annual rate released today by the Commerce Department. Compared to December a year earlier, total construction spending inched up only 0.8%, not seasonally adjusted, the lowest growth rate since October 2011, coming out of the Great Recession. Now, we can add that to the list of all the other numbers that are telling us that very rough times are ahead. Meanwhile, debt levels in the U.S. just continue to explode. According to the latest report, Americans now have 480 million credit cards. That is about 100 million more than during the last recession. In other words, there are about 1.5 credit cards for every man, woman, and child in the entire country. The total amount of credit card debt in the United States has now reached a whopping $870 billion. That number has never been higher in the history of our nation. And when you total up all forms of individual debt, U.S. consumers are now $13.5 trillion in the hole. Corporate debt levels are exploding as well, and this is something that Dallas Fed President Robert Kaplan warned us about on Tuesday. U.S. non-financial corporate debt consists mostly of bonds and loans. This category of debt as a percentage of gross domestic product is now higher than in the prior peak reached at the end of 2008, Kaplan said. A number of studies have concluded this level of credit could potentially amplify the severity of a recession, he noted. The lowest level of investment-grade debt, BBB bonds, has grown from $800 million to $2.7 trillion by year-end 2018. High-yield debt has grown from $700 million to $1.1 trillion over the same period. This trend has been accompanied by more relaxed bond and loan covenants, he added. Overall, corporate debt has more than doubled since the last financial crisis, and that is just one of the reasons why our financial system is far more vulnerable today than it was just before the last financial crisis. This week, we also learned that the federal budget deficit is exploding as well. The following comes from Business Insider. According to a report from the Treasury Department released Tuesday, the budget deficit, that is the difference between what the federal government takes in and what it spends, hit $310 billion in the first 4 months of fiscal year 2019. Fiscal years for the federal government run October through September, so the data reflects the shortfall from October 2018 through January 2019. Based on the data, the deficit increased by 77% compared to the same period the prior year. A 77% increase in 1 year? I don't even have the words to describe how foolish this is. Over the last 10 years, we have added more than $11 trillion to the national debt, and that means that it's been growing at a pace of more than $1 trillion a year. To call this a major national crisis would be a massive understatement, and yet there is absolutely no urgency in Washington to address this absolutely critical issue. We are literally destroying the financial future of this nation, but most Americans don't seem to understand the gravity of the situation that we are facing. The Congressional Budget Office projects that the national debt and interest on that debt will both explode at an exponential rate in future years if we stay on the path that we are currently on. According to the CBO, in fiscal 2018, the government spent $371 billion on net interest, while the Defense Department budget was $599 billion. Social Security benefits cost $977 billion, Medicare $585 billion, and Medicaid $389 billion, and that's according to CBO estimates. But the CBO said interest outlays rate of growth in fiscal 2018 was faster than that for the three mandatory federal programs. Social Security up $43 billion or 5%, Medicaid up $14 billion or 4%, and Medicare up $16 billion or 3%. In comparison, net interest on the public debt increased by $62 billion or 20%. The $371 billion that we spent on interest could have been spent on roads, schools, airports, strengthening our military, or helping the homeless. Instead, it was poured down a black hole. As interest rates rise, it's being projected that we will soon be spending more on interest on the national debt than we do on national defense. And not too long after that, interest on the national debt will cost us more than the entire Social Security program each year. The bigger our debt gets, the more interest we have to pay, and the CBO is projecting that we will add another $12 trillion to the debt during the 2020s. Washington has been drowning in red ink for years and is only going to get a lot worse over the next decade, a fresh government estimate shows. The U.S. is likely to add $12 trillion in public debt from 2020 to 2029 through a combination of higher government spending and slower economic growth, according to the Congressional Budget Office. Of course, CBO estimates are almost always way too optimistic, and so reality will probably be a lot worse than that. But if government debt is so bad, why do we just keep on accumulating more of it? Well, the truth is that government debt always makes the short term look better. When the government borrows money and spends it into the economy, it increases GDP. In essence, we're sacrificing our long-term prosperity in order for some short-term gain. If we went back and removed the $11 trillion that the federal government borrowed and spent over the last decade, we would be in the worst economic depression in American history right now. But by stealing from the future, the federal government has been able to stabilize things. Unfortunately, the future always arrives eventually, and our future is looking extremely bleak at the moment. We are on pace to add way over $1 trillion to the national debt this year, and one of the big things fueling this horrific debt binge is our rapidly expanding interest payments. Finally, and perhaps most concerning, is that for the first 4 months of this fiscal year, interest payments on the U.S. national debt hit $192 billion, $17 billion or 10% more than in the same 4-month period last year, and the most interest ever paid in the first third of the fiscal year. As Reuters' Jeff Hall points out, annualizing the $192 billion interest expense means that the interest on U.S. public debt is on track to reach a record $575 billion this fiscal year, more than the entire budget deficit in financial year 2014, that was $483 billion, or the 2015 financial year, $439 billion, and equates to 2.7% of estimated GDP, the highest percentage since 2011. But according to the proponents of modern monetary theory, or MMT, we can spend as much money as we want because, quote, deficits almost never matter, unquote. Because MMT holds that government spending isn't funded by taxes, the Green New Deal doesn't include any measures to finance the very large, open-ended fiscal commitments it would undertake. According to MMT economists, the only possible danger from the resultant government debt would be inflation, which can usually be controlled with tools other than raising taxes. In other words, deficits almost never matter. So confident are they of their theory's universal applicability that MMT proponents often respond to their critics with scorn. If you can believe it, there are actually members of Congress that believe this stuff. Of course, the truth is that our national debt is an existential threat to the continued existence of our nation, and this is a point that I've made repeatedly. The U.S. economy was in far better shape just prior to the financial crisis of 2008 than it is now, and today we are drowning in far more debt than we were at that time. The stage is set for the most terrifying economic horror show in American history, and the clock is ticking away with each passing day.